Good evening. Welcome to tonight's program. We're pleased to have Diane with MainStreet Thrive as well as Michael from ITNS Consulting for tonight's program. My name is Kara Blue. I am a public services librarian here at Hedberg Library, and I would like to thank JATV for recording the program tonight. And I am going to hand it over to Diane to introduce Michael more formally.
Hello, everyone. I'm Diane with MainStreet Thrive. First of all, we will go around the room and introduce everyone that is here, because a couple people don't know the person in front.
Aaron Folk with Dymax.
Liz Mueller-Foltz with your assistant.
Kim Arnold with ITNS Consulting.
Gary Hedberg, Chief of Operations at ITNS Consulting.
Thank you, everyone. I will introduce Michael in just a moment. The reason we wanted to do this presentation at this time of the year is, gee, what have we had recently? Bad weather.
Right.
What have we had recently? An outage of internet. All things like that will affect your business continuity. Also fires, any thefts, things like that. So Michael is going to be talking about different areas and how you can protect your business. He has extensive experience in the cybersecurity and IT consulting area. And he will, I think the first slide, he goes into more of that. Yep. So take it away, Michael.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. As Diane said, I am Michael Arnold. I am the founder and the CEO of ITNS Consulting. I'm a certified advanced security practitioner, along with being a Microsoft Systems Administrator, a Cisco Network Associate, among other certifications that I hold. I have over 20 years worth of experience professionally in the IT field. I've worked with law firms, accounting firms. I've even done some municipalities over the years. Manufacturing, so on and so forth. I've also been on various podcasts, webcasts, various talk, speech, things like this, as well as we put out a lot of free content out on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. So let's dive right into it. The greatest risk to a business is the business resiliency is actually the failure to plan. And so we're going to go over 10 areas that we need to start looking at as a business to see, where can we improve our business resiliency, what things might be missing, and various things like that that are going to help us keep our businesses running in the event of a disaster, or at least make us more recoverable, even if we can't necessarily stay running. Know your risks. So, a couple of years ago, nobody really thought that a pandemic that was going to shut down the whole United States was actually going to happen, but it did. And so we all scrambled for a while trying to figure out, like, what could we do to kind of keep things running. A lot of people worked from home. There was a big push to the cloud. Some people had their own servers and things like that, so a lot of VPNs were hastily set up and things like that. And so our number one thing is, identify the risks, and we need to identify the most serious risks to the business, and then focus on the likely disruptions and their impact. Things that we want to keep an eye on for that is to identify and rank the greatest risks from like the most probable and likely to the least probable and likely. We also need to consider the risks and threats related to the business that stem from nature of your operations, as well as very specific situations that may originate from inside your organization. Human error, poor training, maintenance, illness, death. I want to stop here on that one. I worked with a client years ago that had a law firm, and the gentleman who was the managing partner and the owner of the law firm died one morning. And he did not have a succession plan in place. There was a lot of things that he had as far as his day-to-day duties. Nobody really knew how to do it. Nobody had access to the money. Nobody had access to keep things going. So it made for a very rough month or two in the wake of his passing to keep their business running. They did survive it. They did pull out of it. But, you know, the failure to plan is like a plan for failure, okay? We also need to review, like, what is in our county? You know, like, there's places in the United States where, you know, there's wildfires every year. Here in Wisconsin, we get tornadoes and severe thunderstorms. Some places get earthquakes, hurricanes, things like that. You can look at the county and see what geographical things might affect your business. Number two, it's really important to understand your operations. You need to understand your business's most critical functions and how to perform them if there's a disruption. So as you're going through making your plan, you need to identify the business's functions and processes that are critical to the survival of your business. Document, document, document. We need to document the important information for each business function and process. We need to rank those business functions by priority from extremely high to low. And then we need to develop documentation for a contingency plan for threats from the highest to lowest as well. You need to be as specific as possible, and you need to be able to cross-train these things amongst your staff in the event that, you know, some key personnel happens to be out that day. It could be vacation, they could be out sick, a variety of other things. But always consider whether or not your employees are capable of doing these things, because it may take a little bit more than just the processes and the procedure documentation to actually get them to perform those duties. Again, that leads us to knowing your employees. So document the employee information so that you can connect with them before, during, and after disruption. So this is about communication. This is also delegation of duties and a variety of different things like that. But you should probably also have a contact sheet, especially if you're in a larger enterprise, where, you know, you need to be able to reach out to the COO, the CFO, and anybody else who may not actually be on site at that particular time to keep all the stakeholders in play for what's going on, time to resolution, time to recovery, those kinds of things. Know your equipment. This is critical. Protect critical equipment to keep your business running. As Diane had said at the beginning of this presentation, you know, here recently we survived some storms. Several businesses went out because of those storms. They lost power. They lost internet connectivity. A couple weeks back, it was a nice clear day, and we still lost internet throughout most of Janesville. So you need to kind of think about what is important to keep your business running. If you depend on the internet, you really, really need to think about, can I get an alternate internet access? That could be cellular, that could be like a cellular hotspot that you can switch over to, maybe even running in a whole nother line from another internet service provider. The key to that one is make sure that they're not in the same street, because construction is a thing here in Wisconsin. And so we want to make sure that, you know, if they go to tear up the street, they're not going to knock you out. Power is another thing. You know, we all live in a digital society. Not everything runs on batteries. So if you have point of sale systems, servers, a variety of other things that rely on power, you may want to think about battery backup systems. You may also want to think about a generator, depending on the nature of your business. The key here is to identify those risks and then devise a plan. If you can't already do it, put it on your roadmap to see how you're going to go about taking care of those things. You also want to look at any available replacements for things. Like, you know, if you had a bad storm and say your building got hit by lightning and it took out half a dozen computers, you kind of want to know, like, oh, well, what kind of computers do I have? Storage, RAM, all that kind of stuff, so that you could quickly get replacements and replace that equipment. Know how to reduce the potential disruptions. So everything these days can be a potential disruption. I've worked with banks for many, many years. And one of the things that they look at in banks, you know, because banks don't like to go down, they also cross-train with, you know, shooting incidences. Just here recently, we had an active shooter, you know, go in. Actually, it was a bank employee. Just, what was it, yesterday or the day before? It was a disgruntled employee, came in, shot the place up, killed several people. And it's very unfortunate. But we live in a society nowadays where we have to expect the unexpected. And so you could get active shooter type training from your local sheriff's department, your local SWAT team. They'd be happy to come into your business and have that conversation with you. So contact the county or the local police department and schedule that. There are also other things that you need to look at, you know, like cyber threats. They don't go away. We live, again, in a digital age where you're going to get hacked. It's just a matter of time, when, and what is going to be the extent of the blast radius. Some other things that you want to make sure that you identify for and plan for in the disruption is, you know, any makeup capabilities. Say you had a total loss. So would you be able to move your operations to another location? We in the IT field, we call that a cold site, a warm site, or a hot site. A cold site would be something where, hey, I got a friend, he's got a space, but I don't have any equipment, I don't have anything there, I'd have to start from scratch. A warm site, you partially have it set up, but maybe you need to bring in an internet connection, maybe you need to move some computers around, get some desks, some things like that. And a hot site is literally a hot failover. It's a carbon copy of whatever you would need to be able to switch operations over to that place. You need to keep an eye on your product and your inventory. Do you need refrigeration? Do you know, power for refrigeration, or even the refrigerators themselves? Would you be able to move your product somewhere else, you know, to prevent spoilage? Utilities, again, like I said, you know, electric, gas, sewer, water, internet, all things that we need to pay attention to. You also should have a shutdown and startup plan. You know, in the event that something goes bad, you want to pay attention to, you know, what does it take to start my business back up? And if I had to shut things down because of inclement weather, well, we need to know what that plan is to, you know, do I shut the computers down before I shut down the servers, before I shut down everything else? You know, what about my point of sale stuff? What about lighting? All that kind of stuff. We kind of want to have a checklist for what you would have to do to shut things down. You also need to you should also be working with other providers as far as having like service plans, look at other vendors, possible cleanup and restoration, depending on the nature of your business is. Also keep track of local authorities and other public services. That leads us to know your key customers, your contacts, suppliers, and vendors. Now, when I say contacts here, that context is kind of like around your insurance agencies, your landlord, any other stakeholders that you may have in the business. Obviously, customers is self-explanatory, suppliers and vendors. So you want to ensure that you can continue service to your customers in the event of the disruption. So keep track of a call list. Who would I need to call when the bad thing happens? And notice I said when the bad thing happens, right? Because this is preparing for those things. If possible, avoid relying solely on the suppliers and vendors that are in the same geographic area if you have bad weather situations. Again, that would be like your earthquakes, your wildfires, if you're in a hurricane situation. If all your vendors are local, then they're going to get wiped out too, or they're going to be overwhelmed with trying to get everybody else back up. You're going to have to take a number. You should establish relationships with alternate or backup suppliers and vendors because of that reason. And you should also establish a variety of ways to communicate, not just with your employees and your stakeholders, but also with your customers. If you're going to be down for 3 days and you've got key customers, you need to put that out there that, hey, we're having a disruption. This is our expectation. This is our time to recovery, and so on, and keep them in the loop, because that helps keep confidence in your brand. Okay, because you want to make sure that, you know, you've taken all these years to build your brand. You don't want to have that go away because communication stopped and people can't get to you and you can't service them. Know your information technology. I can't even begin to tell you how critical this is. I'm getting a little dry, so give me just a second here. Notice number one, if possible, consult a qualified IT expert to assist you with your technology needs of your business. As much as I'd love to do business with everyone in this room, I can't. There are other quality vendors that are out there. But to make sure that you're working with somebody who understands the technology that you use and you utilize every day. They're going to be able to tell you what you have for your inventory. what you need to keep running, and what it would take to replace those things if things went badly. They would also be able to help you with your backup and disaster recovery, which I got to say is probably the most critical. If you don't do anything else on this list, make sure that you're backing up all critical systems and data. Back up every system if you can. We live in a day and age where this stuff has gotten extremely affordable, okay? There's no reason to have file and folder backups anymore. They fail more often than they're successful. You really should be looking at some kind of an image-based and appliance-based backup solution that also acts as a business continuity device in the event that you're down. Image-based systems literally do exactly that. They image what is on your computers, on your servers, and you're actually able to spin those up in a virtual environment and continue business within minutes rather than hours, days, possibly weeks that it could take with older traditional types of backups. In addition to that, you also should be backing up all your data that's stored in the cloud. Data that's stored in the cloud is not backed up by default. It's high availability. There are copies of your data, but if somebody gets in, it could be a worker. You yourself could accidentally delete a file folder and then forget about it. And the trash can is only good for about 30 days, and then it goes away. And then suddenly, oh my God, 31 days, and I got to have it, and you don't have it anymore. So having a backup for your software as a service solutions, like your Microsoft 365, Google Workplace, to keep those items backed up is critical. You should be documenting all of your computer equipment. And again, this is one of those things where if you're working with a managed service provider, they would have an accurate, through their remote management monitoring tools, they would have an accurate accounting of what you have for computers, printers, servers, what you would need for wireless and all those kinds of things. But if you don't have that and you don't have the ability to do that, you actually should be documenting all of your computer equipment, hardware, software, any of the vital records, the configurations for everything, because you have to think about what if I had to start from scratch, right? What would it take if I just had a bunch of gear dropped off and I got to start from zero? That's how you should be creating your plan. Also make arrangements with other IT vendors to replace that damaged hardware or software and to set it up at a recovery location. Again, we talked about the cold site, warm site, hot site type situation. Know your finances. You got to know your money. This is true in all cases. Cash flow solves problems. If you don't have cash flow, if you don't have reserved funds, you can't make it through a disaster. You're going to be struggling. It's going to be very, very hard. The rule of thumb for most businesses is that you should set aside approximately 6 months worth of payroll, taxes, your overhead, and set that aside and don't touch it. That's your emergency fund. Because you'll go through that really quick in a disaster, and you're going to need that. Also, if you had some reputational damage that happened because of it, you're going to need to continue to pay your staff and whatnot until you can build back trust again. You should also have a credit card and establish a line of credit. Identify your financial obligations and expenses that have to be paid. Don't assume that because your area was hit by a disaster, your suppliers are just going to be forgiving. Your landlord is still going to want rent, even though you're looking at ashes. Okay, and you should also be in touch with your insurance companies to see what you need to do next. And this is critical in this situation where, if you had a loss, you need to be able to file a claim. What does it take for those claims? What type of documentation would you have to provide? And what is your wait time to actually get funds to keep you up and going? Employees should sign up for electronic fund transfers. Writing checks is not always, if you're a really small business, I understand why you're still writing checks. I still write checks. But if you can electronically manipulate that money, then that also means that your employees can continue getting paid. back to the insurance thing, you need to make sure that you have your standard liability insurances, that you have insurances on maybe your equipment. Outside of your errors and omissions, you need to have cyber liability insurance. And I will tell you, with cyber liability insurance, if you had a cyber attack, you're going to need to be able to prove your security posture. And that's critical. No longer do cyber liability insurances want to be paying for ransomware and things like that. You would need, ransomware can happen to anybody, even if you're paying attention. But if you have no security posture, you don't have a security program, you don't have the right policies and procedures, you don't have proof that you've been doing these things, you will not have a successful claim when it comes to cyber liability insurance. And I could go on with that in a whole nother discussion. You also need to make sure whether or not you need any separate riders for any potential things like fire, flood, water. Even on your homeowner's policy, in most cases, water is not included, but mold is. It's a weird thing. So check with your insurance companies and see whether or not you would need to have any special riders or any of that kind of stuff. And then establish clear strategies and procedures for controlling those costs and reporting the information to the appropriate groups and clearly budgeting so that you can track what's actually being spent during a disruption so that you know and can plan more later, okay? Use it as a lesson learned, which leads me to my next step. Know when to update and test your plan. So it's kind of like backups. If a backup is not tested, it's not really a backup, right? So your plan is not really a plan if you don't test it. Again, when I was working with banks, we would actually do that. We would arrange a time to take them completely offline and switch all processes over to another hot site, or what would be one of their branch sites. And we would go through this scenario of actually doing it, switching everything over. We would know how long it took. We would know how well it worked. And we would have a discussion afterward, and calling it a lessons learned, to see what we might need to do to improve upon that plan, to make it more resilient, to make it faster. Did we overlook something? Did something go badly in the process? And we did that a lot with a variety of different things. So I suggest that you do the same thing with your business and your plan. And you should probably update and check that plan every 6 to 12 months because life changes. Anytime that you have changes in your business, whether that be different pieces of software, it might change your plan. Different hardware might change your plan. If you moved from being on-site to the cloud, I guarantee you it changed your plan. But as you're going through all of this stuff, keep employees up to date with any plan changes because you're going to need their help to be able to put it into action. Lastly, know where to go for help, okay? Community leaders, emergency management office staff, police and fire departments, emergency medical services, key staff from government agencies, utility companies, etc. There's a wealth of information out there that's available to you for free. All you have to do is raise your hand and ask. And that's just it. Make sure that you're building ties with the community and outside agencies who can help you recover quickly from that disaster. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. So does anybody have any questions or concerns, things that they'd like to comment?
I have some scenarios I can bring up.
Sure.
Can I bring you the microphone, Diane?
Hello. Yes, I have some scenarios to bring up of times that I've gone through this in my career. And some of it was planned, some of it was not planned out. And so one of them, you talked about hotspots, moving
Yes,
hotspots.
hot sites.
So when I worked for Office Depot and the hurricanes were hitting southern Florida, you could tell when they were going into hurricane mode because they were backing up. We would get paper at the store. Everything that was ever transmitted having to do with the store, we got a copy of it. And we kept on having to put reams of paper in because we were getting back up there. So they decided to move and have another help desk scenario in Atlanta. And they thought, okay, we can just switch it over to Atlanta. Then there was that year that the hurricane that hit Florida hit Atlanta.
Yep.
All of a sudden, they didn't have backup in their first, or they didn't have a working area in their first or their second. And after that, I got moved to Michigan because they figured whatever happens in Florida is not going to happen in Michigan.
Right.
So there was a multi-million-dollar company that thought they had the perfect backup solution, and it failed them.
Yes.
So when Michael said you have to run through it and know where these are located.
Even when you're looking at backup, like if you're paying for a cloud backup or you're paying for a backup solution, you should make sure that the data centers that your data is being held in are in geographically separated areas. The companies that I work with are on the East Coast and West Coast. I can't work with anybody outside of the United States because I do a lot of compliance work. But we have bi-coastal or tri-coastal data centers that are backing these things up for that very reason. So yeah, that's Atlanta is obviously not far enough away.
Right. They thought it was, they thought it was. And then I actually went through a tornado situation when I worked for Quick Trip up in Sauk City. I just happened to look out my back window and the sky was as black could be. And I knew I had a crew down at the store that was young or fresher. And I knew that once that power went back on again, if we didn't do our coolers correct, we were going to fry our electrical system.
Yeah.
Because those the circuits had to be turned on, not all at once, and we would have just browned out.
And that speaks to the startup and shutdown
Right.
that I was talking about. Make sure you got a startup and shutdown list. Yes, absolutely.
And so in that particular scenario, I went down to the store. Well, everything happened and we lost power and everything got black throughout the community. And we found out a 4-car garage went into the nursing home, got picked up, went into the nursing home. Just happened to be where I lived. That was my garage that went. So I was really happy I wasn't home. But here's a scenario that I lived through. In the fact is, Perdisac and Sauk were completely out of power. The fire department, the ambulance services, the police, they needed power someplace. So they turned on, because they knew I was down at the store, so they turned on our block so that they could get gas for their chainsaws, for their equipment, because if they didn't have a backup plan on where they were going to get this. So sometimes when you think that you're going to be looking at emergency management to have all the answers, it just depends on the scenario and what happens, because every scenario, a tornado coming through is going to hit a different path every time.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. On the last slide, reach out to your community leaders, and one of those was emergency management, right? The time to be doing that is not in an emergency. Okay, let's caveat that and put a pin in that right there. The time for doing those things is not during the emergency. You should have an understanding of how emergency management is going to work when the emergency happens. So therefore, you can build that into your plan. But yes, that's an excellent point right there, is that everything is in such havoc. They don't have time to deal with everything and every little occurrence that arises. I mean, we've seen entire communities just get flattened. And can you imagine the logistics, the cleanup? What do you do for medical services? What are you doing just to give people water, just to keep things afloat? So yeah, that's an amazing thing that you just brought up, because you actually went through that,
Yeah, it was, the storm went through at about 8:30. I finally left the store at 5 o'clock the next morning because things were just, they needed, Quick Trip ended up being part of the emergency management scenario because.
Eminent domain. We need this now.
Right. So they, like you said, water and just gas and different things like that, and food, because now all of a sudden you have people that need to feed some of these people. So
Right.
We just did that. The other thing is with Office Depot, in numerous scenarios where they had hurricanes come through, they would literally go in, pull the electronics, and give the keys to the city leader, who's ever in charge
Yep.
of emergency management, and said, here, take what you need to do this. If it's legal pads, pens, all of those things that they don't have stocked for
Right.
scenarios like this. And they just pretty much, other than things that they could take out of the store. But many times, we're talking flood damage in these stores that are like 3 feet.
Well, and similarly, think about what happened during the pandemic, the shutdown. Places that never did anything having to do with masks were suddenly trying to find masks, source stuff, sourcing hand sanitizers, making hand sanitizers, all these different things. Like, obviously, we never had really a plan for how to deal with a pandemic, and we can argue all day long about whether it was handled well or not. I would hope that if this ever happens again, it's handled better. But if you didn't have a plan before, and if our government hasn't figured out a plan since, they actually should sit down and think about that, because we never thought it was going to happen, and it happened. To your point, Office Max is giving Office Depot is giving things away to the emergency workers and the emergency management people, to keep them afloat, to give them the tools that they need to keep going. It's very similar to what happened again in the pandemic. Whatever people needed is what happened, and it's good that our communities can pull together like that. It's as human beings, we need a kind of a common foe. We can argue all day long. You might be a competitor of mine, and so on and so forth. But once we have a common goal, now we're shoulder to shoulder, and we're pulling through it together. And I saw a lot of that happening, in the tech field throughout the pandemic, as people were understaffed, and we needed to keep businesses going, and everybody was just pitching in to make it happen. So.
Well, and like you brought up, the pandemic was a good, I guess, tool to have these conversations. But, some of the things that we talked about tonight is that was bringing your customer in and out of your business.
Yep.
And how to keep in contact. But a lot of the scenarios you brought up were things that could happen. You may not have a building standing to bring a customer in and out.
Exactly.
And that should be, another step of the pandemic plan is, what if we don't have the building? What can we do?
Right.
We saw a lot of restaurants pivot to like a food truck.
Yep.
Because they couldn't.
Drive-throughs popped up overnight. DoorDash became huge.
Right.
So,
there's different ways, but I think every small business almost needs to have that what if.
Yes.
What if this happens? How can we still function?
Yes. That is absolutely critical. And for all businesses. If you're brick and mortar, it's even harder, but it's doable. If you know a web designer, maybe you're brick and mortar and you're also click and mortar. So you can do a little of both. And then if something bad like that happens, well, then you just switch everything over to online businesses. But again, you have to communicate that, right? You have to be able to communicate that not only to the stakeholders, but to your vendors, to your clients, and all of that kind of stuff, your customers. And so how would you get that out in the media? That you're no longer available at this location, but go here. You've been a valuable customer. You've helped me build my business. If you want to keep buying my wares, where would I get that and how would I get that? And so being able to communicate a lot of that stuff. As you said, food trucks happened. But people that spun up the food trucks, they had to get that message out to their clients who couldn't come into their restaurant anymore, right? And so how did they do that? Well, radio spots, newspaper spots, a lot of social media, and just being there and telling people, So, yeah, all of that stuff is very critical. Again, you don't know what the disaster is going to be, and it's impossible to plan for everything. And that's why when I say, look at your risks, you have to look at those risks and weigh them as, everything is a risk, right? And if we have to look at the probabilities and the likelihoods, something may have a high probability but a low likelihood. But conversely, it may have a high likelihood but a lower probability. How do you weigh that out, right? And so it's an individual choice, because you can't throw money at everything. And not everything in this list takes money. You know, some of it's just planning and being prepared. You know, I've seen power outages wipe configurations off of routers and switches. Okay, the router and switch itself is fine. But do you remember how that was configured from 5, 10, 15 years ago? If you don't have a recent router configuration that you can upload into it, you're doing it all by hand. So what was it that we needed? Oh yeah, well, we need this, and oh, we need that, and you're scrambling for weeks before you figure out what all needs to be in your firewall. Stuff like that, you know? So it can be the littlest things that can mean the most. And you don't necessarily know what that is. It could be a checklist that pulls you out of the ditch. It could be a flash drive that has things. The number one thing that I will say, though, is if you're building these plans, you absolutely do not keep them 100% in digital, okay? Because if your digital goes down, you have no way of getting to it. So in the banks, we actually had flip books, okay? And yes, there was flip books for if there was a robbery, if the, you know, what to do, and of course they practice this stuff all the time. But they actually had laminated flip books of the highest probability, the highest likelihood stuff that could happen to their business. And then they also kept in a safe printed out copies of the checklists and processes and procedures that they needed. And they would update that stuff. They kept it in binders, and they would update that stuff routinely. Yes, there's a master copy that they printed it from that's in the digital world, but don't rely on your technology. You know, if there was an EMP today, technology's gone. You know, your 68 Chevelle might run. You might be okay with that. You might be okay with your 80s motorcycle, but everything else is dead. Okay, unless you got a Timex watch, everything else is dead. So what do you do from there, right? How would you get what you need? I don't want to sound like I'm a, you know, tin hat, but it is a reality. We all know.
Well, and you know, you discussed getting out on social media, the message if something happens, you know, keep your customers informed. If a whole area is out of power.
Now it's the old telephone game. Pass this message on to Bob. Bob passed that on to Carol. Carol passed this on to Janet. Exactly.
Yeah,
You know,
because for one thing, probably our cell phones are not going to work there. Nobody's going to be able to get onto Facebook.
Right.
Because, as you said, their router and
we don't even have payphones anymore. So I mean, you know.
So you almost have to think of a way outside the box, too, of how do you get that message out?
And it could be something simple like a CB radio. It could be something simple like walkie-talkies. And if you know other people who have radios and walkie-talkies, maybe they can pass your message on. You know, again, you kind of have to think way outside the box and think of, you know, what are we going to have to do? You know, because in this society, we rely so much on digital. And the minute that you think, well, I don't need digital, now you're staring at a wall, you're reading a book, or you're walking your dog. I mean, like literally, that's not a whole lot left. Everything else, including now your appliances, are not only consuming power, but, you know, you got these smart fridges, you got, you know, all this different technology connected to everything. You know, so what happens when that all goes away?
Any other comments?
Oh, I know you got one to share. Share one. You don't have one to share?
All right, then I'm going to make a joke. That I do know how to make coffee without any electronics.
That's
Thank
awesome.
you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you coming and sharing your stories. And, you know, we're available if anybody has any questions or concerns, wants to bring anything up.
Questions for people that are here and that may see this,
Mm-hmm.
or that we may share and find businesses that, oh, you missed this, but you should have come. Yeah, you missed this, but you should have come to it. Are they able to give your company a call
Oh, absolutely.
and go through the kind of this checklist and see how prepared they might be or not
Yes.
prepared?
Absolutely. They can contact us at any time. They can also find us and follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. You know, look for the next presentation. Look us up on the web. Look us up in the phone book. You know, if there is such a thing anymore. Do phone books even exist? I figured the library would actually. Okay, so go to your local library to look us up in the phone book. There you
Yeah.
go.
And then the other thing is, people that might be listening to this, we are having active shooting training next month by the Janesville Police Department on May 17th, 19th, something like that, whatever that Tuesday is. You can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, because we have the information in the sign up there. But the Janesville Police Department is going to do an hours-long training on active shooting for small businesses, just so that we can get prepared. And, you know, part of, and I believe that was one of the areas you said too,
Yes.
is reach out to your local police department. So they're coming in to do a presentation at the library here for all small businesses.
We're going to be here, what, June 13th? Yeah, so we're coming back June 13th to do, you know, cybersecurity and what was the name of it? Yeah, hacking. How would you know if you've been hacked? And things to look for and things to prepare for. And again, what are the best ways to get rid of stuff like that if it happens? So stay tuned. Thank you, everyone.